series on the Hillside Stranglers, and the link for that is down below. Okay, let's get into our case today. Heidi Bernadzikowski was born into a very devout Roman Catholic family, and she was one of 5 children. She was actually the only girl, and her mom told Dateline she wasn't like the princess of the family like you might expect. She could definitely hold her own with all of her brothers, and she was very tough. She was born in Baltimore, where she played a lot of sports as a child. Heidi's parents really ran a very tight ship. Like everyone was expected to be at the dinner table to eat together. They were expected to attend Mass every Sunday. It was a strict but loving family. As Heidi hit her teenage years, she began to rebel against her parents and their strict rules. When she was 19 years old, she moved out to try and get a sense of freedom, so her parents weren't always hovering over her. But living out on her own wasn't as much fun as Heidi thought that it would be. She had a roommate that she had some problems with, and she went through several low-paying jobs, working very hard to make ends meet. But no matter how bad things got, she always could get pulled out of a bad mood by a night out with her girlfriends. That made everything seem to be better. It was on one of these girls' nights when Heidi was out playing pool with her friends, and she met a man named Stephen Cook. Stephen worked in the plumbing department at a local Lowe's, and the two really just hit it off right away. And when I say right away, I mean right away. They went home together that night, and 3 days later, they were moving in together. Stephen was very quiet and shy. He was 5 years older than Heidi. So, in 1998, they moved into a townhouse together in Dundalk, Maryland, and they were just happy. Stephen loved Heidi. He never seemed to want to be without Heidi. And after living together for 2 years, they had begun talking about a summer wedding in Las Vegas. At this time, Heidi was working for an insurance company, and she had actually gotten promoted recently. She finally had stability in her financial life, and she was just coming into her own. if someone had tried to break in by picking the lock. And she was terrified when she realized someone was trying to break into her house. So she called the rental agency and she demanded that they come and change the locks. It was like her sense of safety was suddenly gone. Then, one day, this guy knocks on the door, and he told Heidi that he was trying to put together a neighborhood watch program. But this guy wasn't someone Heidi knew from around the neighborhood. And he actually gave her the creeps. She went to work the next day and she was telling her friends about this strange man and the weirdness of the visit. When asked, Heidi described the man as a larger, light-skinned black man or a dark-skinned, Mediterranean white male with black hair. And he had this tattoo on his left arm, and she actually drew it on a piece of paper for the girl she worked with. So she's feeling very nervous. But on April 19th, 2000, the maintenance guy who worked at the for the rental company came and switched out all of the locks to the house. And this made Heidi feel a little bit better. She felt safer. Which is tragic, because Heidi would be dead less than 24 hours later. So Heidi and Stephen shared a car, and usually Stephen would drop Heidi off at work and then come and pick her up around 5 when she got off. And this was exactly what happened on the evening of April 20th. Stephen showed up at Heidi's work and picked her up. He needed to run some errands, but Heidi was tired. She had been working all day and she needed to go home. So he dropped her off and then he heads out to knock out some errands. He got his oil changed, he got a haircut, he ran to Home Depot to get something that he needed to help his sister, and then he went to his sister's house to help her with some plumbing issue. And then he headed home. But what he would find upon arriving would shatter his life forever. Heidi was lying on the living room floor, dead. Her throat had been slashed. Stephen called 911, and when first responders arrived, they found Stephen on the floor, holding Heidi's lifeless body. He was sobbing uncontrollably. On the wall, written in lipstick, was the number 1, and this was station right away to be interviewed. He was still covered in Heidi's blood as he answered questions, but as we all know, when something like this happens, statistically, it's the boyfriend or the husband or someone close to the victim who is responsible. So he explained the blood on his clothing to police, telling them that when he had walked in, he had started CPR, but quickly realized she was dead, and he picked her up and held her. Stephen was very cooperative with police. He told them his whereabouts all day. He told them how he had picked her up from work and taken her home. He gave them a list of places that he had been that evening while Heidi was home alone, and his alibi checked out. All of the places that he had gone had CCTV footage of him, being there, which confirmed his alibi. His sister also confirmed that he had been at her house, and they even had footage from the tunnel he had driven through on his way home. So, police interrogate Stephen for about 6 hours, and then they release him to go home. While he was being interviewed, the crime scene was being studied. Heidi had been strangled, and then her throat had been cut with something very sharp, likely a knife. Detectives noted that in the living room where she was found, there really wasn't any furniture. They studied the number 1 written on the wall above her body. The entire house had been ransacked, drawers had been opened, things had been turned over. But interestingly enough, Heidi's jewelry box was left untouched. So police had they had 2 theories. This was a budding serial killer who had just killed for the first time, or maybe this was a robbery gone wrong. The second theory seemed unlikely, given that none of the jewelry had been touched. In the days after the murder, police believed that the budding serial killer theory wasn't very likely, and they had completely ruled out the home invasion, home robbery gone wrong as well. An autopsy was done, and the medical examiner did find DNA under Heidi's fingernails, but the sample was not able to be submitted or used. So back then, there was no way to separate 2 DNA samples, and there had been 2 DNA samples found under Heidi's fingernails. There were skin cells from Heidi herself, which we all get when we scratch our arm, just by living in our body. We always have usually DNA under our fingernails. But there were also skin cells from an unknown person. But like I said, there was no way to separate the 2. So police had nothing as far as physical interviewed Terry, and he said he didn't even know where Heidi and Stephen lived, and that he was no way involved in her murder. But the police weren't just going to take his word for it. To them, the fact that Heidi's throat was slit and that he was a butcher, like both of these things added up to them. Heidi had talked about the guy having like a tattoo on his left arm, and Terry also had a tattoo on his left arm. And they found something very suspicious about Terry's time card on the day that Heidi was killed. So, where he worked, the time cards were like digital, like you put your time card in and it stamps a time on them. So when you're clocking in and out, there's like a stamp. But on the day of the murder, his times were handwritten in. While this was super suspicious, they had nothing, no witnesses, no evidence, nothing that could place Terry at the scene of the crime. Within weeks, Heidi's case was growing cold, and it would stay that way for years. Heidi's family tried to move on. Heidi's family tried to move on the best they could, and Stephen too seemed to move on with his life. He got married, he had a child, and he was working for the government for Veterans Affairs. 10 years would go by, and there would be no breaks in the case. And this was frustrating to Heidi's family and police. But time was on their side, because the more time that went by, the more DNA testing would advance. And soon, the DNA sample taken from underneath Heidi's nails would be able to be tested. The DNA was resubmitted, and they got a match. And this match was a surprise, because it wasn't anyone who had been on law enforcement's radar. No one they had interviewed. No one who seemed to have any kind of connection to Heidi at all. The match came back to a man named someone had run Alexander's Colorado driver's license in March of 2000 in Maryland. 3 weeks before Heidi's murder, a police officer had stopped a man who was walking down the highway in Baltimore. And I guess whenever you are stopped and police run a check on your license, that check remains in the computer system forever, even if you weren't like arrested or cited or anything. So now police knew Alexander was in Baltimore around the time Heidi was killed. So 2 detectives from Baltimore head out to Colorado to track down Alexander Bennett. They found Alex and they brought him in to talk to him. And he admitted to police that he was in Baltimore. He said he had gone there with some friends. His friends had totally ditched him, so he was just like stuck living on the streets. He said he didn't know anyone, he didn't remember anyone that he met or stayed with or anything during those weeks. Then police say, look, we have your DNA under the fingernails of a woman who was found dead. And he has an explanation for this. He said he was there in Baltimore. He was on a bus, and this woman just went ballistic. He had no idea what caused her to flip out, but she came up to him and started scratching his face and yelling. According to reporting from True Crime Daily, Alex told police, quote, I got kind of scared because I was trying to fight back and I think I hurt her, end quote. Police then showed Alex photos of women and asked if any of these women were the one who attacked him on the bus. And he pointed right at Heidi and said, this was her. Oh yeah. And also, while police were interviewing him, they noticed that he had a tattoo on his left arm. The detective then said, quote, for you to have been in Baltimore at the exact time this occurs, for your DNA to be there, for this tattoo to be on your arm, in the exact location that the victim describes, and she actually drew it. It means there are just a lot of coincidences, end quote. And Alex is like, yeah, definitely, I can see why you would be concerned. This looks really bad. Look, I'm going to give you a name of a friend of mine, and he can be like a character witness for me. So he gives police Grant's name and info. And police run it and see that Grant has a warrant out for his arrest. So they bring him in on something like some petty crime, and they interview him. But Grant doesn't give a good character witness statement for Alex. In fact, he does the opposite. He totally throws him under the bus. He tells police about a time that Alex had gone to Baltimore for a couple weeks. And then when he came back to Colorado, is dead. I knifed someone. End quote. So Grant gives this statement, and police arrest Alexander Bennett for Heidi's murder, and he was extradited to Baltimore to face charges. The murder trial was about to begin, and Grant Lewis, who was like the star witness, had flown into town to testify. Prosecutors felt like they had a slam dunk case. They had a witness, they had DNA, but then Alexander did something no one saw coming. So right before the trial was set to start, like the night before, Alex had this conversation with his mom, and she had told him, like, look, if you were the one who killed this woman, admit it and ask for forgiveness, and God will forgive you. And so he asked to speak with police and prosecutors. They rushed to the courthouse, where Alex admits to everything, and he tells them about this crazy murder plot that no one really saw coming. Alex spells out the gruesome details of the night he murdered 24-year-old Heidi. He says that after he killed her, in an effort to mislead police, he used Heidi's lipstick to write the number 1 on the wall. He then went around the apartment trying to cover his tracks, all before delivering the final assault. He said, quote, after I had wiped everything down, that's when I had the knife, and to make sure that she was dead, I cut her throat, end quote. Bennett also admitted to being the neighborhood watch guy who had tried to break into the house the day before the murder. But there were still a lot of questions, like, why had he killed Heidi? What was his connection to her? Well, Grant and Alex had been scheming up ways to get a lot of money quickly, and they thought up this murder for hire scheme. So, Grant and who was like the star witness for the prosecution, had actually not only been involved in this murder for hire, he had been the mastermind behind this scheme. Police immediately went and picked up Grant for questioning, and they're just trying to figure like this whole mess out. But Grant and Alex were both asking for plea deals before like they would talk anymore. So Grant finally agrees to talk, and he tells police that he and Alex had wanted to start up a nightclub, but they needed money, a lot of money. So they came up with a plan to advertise themselves as professional hitmen. So they put up an ad online, being very careful to word it in a way that couldn't get them into trouble. They advertised professional and discreet house cleaning, and eventually someone contacted them. In his interview with the police, he said, quote, something to the effect that he was looking for probably a hit or something. They said that they actually never planned to kill anyone. They were going to take the money, the upfront money, and then turn the guy into police. But Grant said that Alex went rogue and went through with the murder. And he had no idea his friend was going to do that, or that his friend was capable of it. So police now have this entire different story. Still, like, all of the same players are involved, essentially. But then they have to figure out who would want to hire someone to kill Heidi. Police showed Grant 6 photos of men, and they pointed out the one who had hired them, Stephen Cook. Heidi's family would later say that they knew Stephen had something to do with Heidi's murder because of the insurance policies. Okay, so remember, Heidi was working for an insurance company, and the two had been talking about marriage because insurance was kind of always on her mind. They decided to take out life insurance policies on each other. Heidi had a policy for Stephen in case, like, something were to happen to him, and it was for $700,000. And he had one for her. These are, like, huge amounts of money for, like, a Lowe's employee and a secretary. When they took them out, they both agreed that they were just planning for their future. So Stephen had promised Grant and Alex $60,000 for killing Heidi. Money he thought that he would get from the life insurance payout after she was killed. So now police have motive, and they have these 2 witnesses who were also involved. Grant was arrested for conspiracy to commit murder. Alex took a plea and agreed to testify against Stephen Cook. One morning, Steve took his child to school. He walked into the elementary school, dropped him off, and as he was leaving, he was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. His lawyer fought these charges, saying that Stephen wasn't the one to actually commit the murder. She said that this is a case of an alleged contract killing, but there was no contract, no proof that Stephen was involved at all. So both sides went to work to build a case. But then Stephen made a huge mistake while behind bars. He began talking to other inmates, trying to find someone to murder Grant Lewis, who was also being held in the same prison as he was. Stephen's cellmate went to authorities. He wore a wire, and he was able to get proof that Stephen was trying to set up yet another murder. 1 year after Stephen was arrested, his case went to trial. Heidi's family members testified that her relationship with Stephen wasn't actually going well at all, and that Heidi was making plans to break things off with him and leave. The prosecution said that Heidi wanted out, and Heidi and Stephen wasn't going to let that happen. So he killed her so he could collect the insurance money. The defense tried to spin this entire had met Alex in an online chat room. They claimed the two had engaged in this online relationship, and then Alex flew out to surprise Heidi, but she rejected him, so he got angry and killed her. The defense only had this story that they came up with. There was no evidence to support this theory, this fable at all. The jury deliberated for a day and a half before finding Stephen guilty of first-degree murder, witness intimidation, and attempted murder. Alex, as part of his plea, got 30 years in prison. Grant was sentenced to life in prison. Stephen got life without the possibility of parole, along with 30 additional years for the attempted murder of Grant Lewis. It took over a decade, but Heidi's case was eventually solved. Stephen continues to maintain his innocence in Heidi's murder. At sentencing, Circuit Judge Jan Marshall Alexander told Cook that he had no doubts about the jury's decision, calling the murder one of the most cold-blooded, heartless, manipulative, despicable crimes that I have seen in almost 30 years of law. And that is Heidi's story. I just quickly want to cite my sources for this video. I got information from a Dateline episode titled Indiscretion.